All right, so today we're gonna go over trimming a foot on the bottom of your cylinder. So trimming a foot is gonna allow you to, lighten up the weight of your cylinder. Also, the little foot that you trim at the bottom will eventually allow you to glaze the bottom of your pot, just like on the trimmed part, and then you'll have a nice little foot so that your mug could sit on. So the trimming, again, it's important. It's an important part of the process. You also have to get used to it. With trimming, you're able to remove some extra clay you might have on your mug. You could also fix some of your flaws that you might have on your thrown cylinders. This is what it looks like, what the profile looks like. So that's why you also want to leave a pretty, like a thick bottom, so that you could eventually trim away maybe about 1/4 of an inch. I usually tell you guys to leave it about 1/2 an inch, and then you could eventually trim 1/4 of an inch. So this is the profile of what that looks like. So when you are ready to trim, you'll have a leather hard cylinder. So this has been sitting out for a bit. It's pretty leather hard. I could technically carve on it. First thing I want to do is actually center this on the wheel. So I'm not going to use a bat, and I'm going to use the rings on the wheel to help me center it. The other important part about trimming is that you want to make sure your top is pretty even. If your top is uneven, then when you flip this over, you're going to have an uneven bottom. So that's why when you throw your cylinders, you want to cut off the top to make it nice and even, so that it'll help you out when you're trimming. So I have a nice even top. I'm gonna flip it over, and first thing I want to do is get this on center. So sometimes you might get lucky, and you might get it on the first try, but when I see this turning, it has a little bit of a wobble. In order to figure out the center, I'm gonna hold the needle, and I see that it's marking an area. So here's like the mark that the needle make, but it doesn't make it anywhere else. So I'll find the center of that mark, and I'm just gonna push forward slightly so that I could get a center. And then sometimes you could tell right away. So like right now it's spinning and it's right on center. I don't have to go over it with my needle tool again. So I have found the center of my cylinder. Now that it's centered, I'm gonna grab some soft clay, and I need to secure this on the wheel. So soft clay, and I'm gonna secure this on there. I'm gonna put 2 pieces on the clay. I'm just gonna push down simultaneously at the same time from opposite sides, because if I push from one side, I'm gonna get it off center. So I push at the same time so that my piece stays centered. Same thing on the other side. And now my piece is secured. It's still on center. Tools that you'll need is the needle tool, and then these loop tools, the bigger loop tool to pretty much flatten out the bottom, and then the smaller one to trim the bottom. So the process is, what you want to do is, first thing I like to do with the big loop tool is make like a little well so that I could put my finger on. Because the one thing I also want to do is secure this down. I have secured the sides, but I need this to stay put. With the big loop tool, I'm just making the bottom nice and flat. Alright, so it's flat. I didn't really remove a lot of clay. And now I could remove some clay from the sides. Again, the key, want to kind of push down on the pot, because if you're just trimming like this, sometimes the pot might get caught on the trimming tool and it'll be knocked off. So I'm just holding it down, and with this tool I'm trimming away at the sides. I'm removing any excess clay. It also cleans up my cylinder. I'm only removing a bit. The idea is when you're throwing, you don't want to leave things too thick. You don't really want to trim away too much. You just want to trim away mostly the foot and maybe just remove a little bit off the side. Next thing I like to do is sort of like bevel the edge, and then I'll go over them with my finger to smooth that out. Alright, so now I'm gonna trim my foot. So what you could do is you could establish, how much of a foot you want, like how wide you want this to be. So if you want, you could grab a needle and sort of like draw out your ring. And this is gonna be my foot here, and I'm gonna trim away everything that's at the center, all of this here. Let me zoom in a bit. I'm gonna trim this away. So now with this smaller loop tool, I'm gonna use the squared side first, and I'm just gonna dig in, and you're gonna get these ribbons of clay that are being removed. Could eventually switch to the round side and also remove some of more clay. Don't be afraid to really dig in. I still have that little well there to still help me secure it down. I will remove it in a bit. In the meantime, I'm just taking off all this clay. So see, I'm already starting to have a foot. I can remove that little well while still holding it down still. See, now I've removed some more clay and I'm starting to get my foot. You eventually will have to kind of check and see how much more you got. What I like to do is you tap it. Sometimes you might feel a little bit of a flex. That means maybe you're getting too thin. Like if I press down on it, I don't have much of a flex, so I could still trim away more clay. That tells me I still have enough thickness to trim away at. Eventually, I'll switch over to the bigger loop tool so I could make the bottom nice and flat, because you see at the moment I have like this bit of a spiral. And with this guy, I'm able to get more out, and also give me a flatter bottom. You guys see there my foot? Now I'm just finishing it off, so I like to also round off this edge here. Round it off or bevel it. Okay, you want to do this when the piece is leather hard. Don't let it get too dry either. Alright, so there's my foot. Last thing I'll do is just dip my finger in the water and soften the edge, because I don't want to have a sharp edge. And also smooth out the foot with my finger. Now that it's done, I could remove these bits of clay. And there's my foot. It's about 1/4 of an inch deep, and like I said, will eventually be able to glaze that bottom. The other thing about the foot is where you would also put your signature. I usually write it with a pencil, but so that's a nice place for your signature. And now that you have trimmed the foot, it is basically done. Eventually, just for the practice, maybe cut this in half so that you could see what the profile looks like. You could actually do that right now. Let me go grab a knife. Alright, so I'm gonna cut this in half so you can see the profile. Alright, so there's my profile. So you can see now, like, the thickness is pretty even from top to bottom. I still had, a pretty nice bottom, like, thickness, maybe a little bit over a 1/4 of an inch. There's my foot. So that's the profile. So yeah, eventually you'll want to cut a couple of these in half just so you can see the profile and see how much you have at the bottom to trim. So that's trimming. I'll do it again. I'll move the view so you can see it more from above. Alright, so here's my cylinder. Okay, let's first center it. Use the rings on the wheel to help you get this pretty close to the center. You might get it on the first try. It looks pretty centered, but if it was off center, I could check, with a needle tool. Just hold it tightly in place. Wherever it makes the mark, I'm gonna find the center of that and push it forward slightly. That should help me find the center. Once it's centered, grab some soft pieces of clay, opposite sides, push down simultaneously so that you don't move the cylinder. Now the other two sides, push down simultaneously. Try not to push too much against the pot. Okay, big loop tool. I'm gonna just make the bottom flat. Just give it one pass. Same time, pushing down on my cylinder so it doesn't get knocked off. Alright, so that has made the bottom flat. Before I trim, I'm just gonna make a little well at the center. And I'm gonna put my finger to hold it down, and then now with the big loop tool I could trim away some clay from the side. Just a little bit, not too much. Just so I could clean up my form a bit. Now, so I don't have a sharp edge, I'll just bevel that edge. I'll smooth it over with my finger. Now that I've done that, I'm gonna establish my foot. Get my needle, make my mark. Now with the smaller loop tool, using the squared side, I'm gonna just start removing some of that clay. Again, don't be afraid to dig in and like hold on to the loop tool pretty tightly so it doesn't, because when you hold on to it loosely, like it'll sort of like just get caught. So hold on to it tightly. as you trim away. At the same time, I'm pushing down on my piece so it doesn't get knocked off. I'll switch over to the round side, remove some more clay. I will eventually start removing that little well. Once I feel like I have a deep enough foot, I'm gonna switch over to the bigger loop tool, and now that I have more surface area with this one, I'm able to make it nice and flat. I'm still sort of like pushing down on my cylinder so it doesn't get knocked off as I trim. And you want to make sure you have a pretty good amount of clay at the bottom so that you could trim kind of deep, about 1/4 of an inch deep. Now that I have my depth, I'm just cleaning up the rest, so just rounding off the edges so they're not all sharp. So that's rounding it off, and then just wet my fingertip, and now it's just about compressing and smoothing out the edges. So again, I don't want to have sharp edges. So there's my foot. It's about 1/4 of an inch deep. It's better to have deeper feet because if your feet are too shallow, then what could happen when you glaze the bottom, there's a good chance that that shallow foot and the glaze is just going to be too close to the bottom of the kiln shelf, and that glaze might just slump down into the kiln shelf and you'll have a pretty ugly bottom. So it's better to have deeper feet again so that you're able to put glaze on the foot and not be worried that that's gonna sort of like slump down into the kiln shelf. That's why I say about 1/4 of an inch. Again, trimming the feet just finishes off the cylinder, makes it look nicer, a lot cleaner. You're able to clean up your cylinders when you're trimming. Again, pay attention to the foot here. So I like to bevel the edges, kind of establish the width of my foot, and then trim away at the center to about 1/4 of an inch deep. I think overall the thickness of my bottom was about 1/2 an inch, so that I'm able to trim away about 1/4, and then, it just finishes it off and makes it look a lot nicer and cleaner. So trimming is part of the process of making cups, mugs, cylinders, and pots on the wheel. Again, it takes away some of that extra clay and it just finishes it off so it looks nicer rather than it being a flat bottom. So you guys will want to trim at your pieces. It does take practice. Again, just like making the whole pot on the wheel, you still need to practice trimming quite a bit so you could get comfortable with it. So make quite a few cylinders or pots, and then practice your trimming. And then you could also eventually play around with the feet and the design of the feet. It doesn't necessarily just have to be like this. You could play around with different types of feet, which there are. So there's that. Again, showing you the profile. You can take a look at your profile at some point, like make a bunch of these and then cut some in half so you can see them. And that's the trimming process. Give it a try and good luck.